Police officers and firefighters are more likely to die by suicide than in the line of duty. Danny Warner from Chateau Recovery joins us today to talk about addiction recovery, avoiding archaic practices, and making a lasting difference. They use evidence-based practices in their work with first responders and are one of only a few providers recommended by the Fraternal Order of Police. He talks about the importance of keeping up with current technologies like neurofeedback and getting a support network involved. Mental wellness and trauma support are key for law enforcement officers, paramedics, EMTs, firefighters, and current and former members of the military. Enjoy. Welcome to the Illuminate Recovery podcast. We shed light on mental health issues, mental illness, and addiction recovery, ways to cope, manage, and inspire. Beyond the self-care we will discuss, you may need the help of a licensed professional. My name's Kurt Nider. I'm a husband, a father, entrepreneur, a handyman, and a student of life. I avoid conflict, I deflect with humor, and I'm fascinated by the human experience.
And I'm Shelley Mangum. I am a clinical mental health counselor, and my favorite role of all times is grandma. I am a seeker of truth, and I feel like life should be approached with tremendous curiosity.
I ask the dumb questions.
I fill in the gaps.
All right, we are super excited today to have Danny Warner. He is the owner and CEO of Chateau Recovery. It is a substance abuse recovery facility in Utah, and Danny's been in this industry a long time. Danny, thanks for coming. Appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Maybe take a minute and talk about how you ended up in the substance abuse industry, because it's a little bit of a unique industry. So talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Well, a long time ago, I had worked in the wilderness world. When wilderness was first started out, one of the very first companies, a company called Anasazi, which took troubled teens out into the woods and taught them how to survive off the land. And that was by far one of my favorite and most rewarding jobs, where I got to get outside of myself and just be able to help people. From there, I kind of took a hard right and went into the business world, where I was really focused on, this widget or that widget, and worked in a bunch of different corporate environments, and had done that for quite a while, and then found myself working in an environment where I got kind of caught up. I was running a company, and I had a couple different CEOs, and they started fighting, and I was kind of in the middle of it. And after a year, I thought, what the heck am I doing with my life? And quit my job, went and traveled Africa for about a year, worked with a bunch of animals, and came back and said, what do I want to do? And I had a couple of requirements. One was I needed to be able to work for myself, and the other one was I needed to be able to work with people, and I needed to be able to feel good about what I was doing each day. When you go home and the majority of your day is spent working, I wanted to feel like I was doing something of value, and not just either making some corporation rich or kind of creating another widget. So after spending a lot of time doing some soul searching and looking at different industries, I landed on this. Came back in and started Chateau Recovery about 8.5 years ago. And we started it just kind of a pretty generalized approach, treating adults dealing with substance abuse. And then over the course of this 8.5 years, as we got into it, we looked around and tried to understand how people have been doing it, what was kind of the standard. Recognized really quickly there's not a standard. There's no kind of best practices, but everyone had been doing it kind of the same way for a long time. At the core, almost 90% of programs were a 12-step program. There was kind of some sacred cows around that, and felt like there was a lot of new evidence and that really wasn't being paid attention to. And so we got in and said, hey, we're going to make sure we're going to have no sacred cows. We're going to look at some different industries, try to bring some best practices in from both the adolescent world and also the mental health world into the substance world, and really try to bring kind of what the new evidence-based practices are telling us, and created a program kind of from scratch. I was able to find a clinical director who shared the same values and same philosophy as me, and we've been working to build a program since then. So.
And I know somewhat of your program. I know some of your therapists, and they are some of the best of the best. And it would be fair to say that your clinical director, Ben, has definitely put a lot of work into that clinical program and the efforts that he puts there. Talk about how Chateau's transformed over the years, because it sounds like, as we've talked, that your focus is shifting a little bit.
Sure. I think we've transformed in a couple ways. The first way is, as we got into this, and there was kind of this idea of you treat adults in addiction. And when you looked at the adolescent world is much better at creating programs that really identify who they treat. So you might have a program that they treat adolescent boys, 16 to 18, who are on the spectrum, who are dealing with some oppositional defiance disorder. And so they get really targeted about who they treat and who they don't treat, and are able to create a program that makes sure they meet the needs of those individuals. But in the adult world, it's pretty wide open. We're treating adults with addiction, and that ranges from the 18-year-old who's still at home to the 70-year-old who is struggling with alcohol. And those two individuals have very different needs and very different places in life. And so during this time, we've recognized that we got to get very specific about who we treat, and more specifically, who we don't treat. And we have settled on a population that is more of a adult population who is more internally motivated. We have kind of carved out a niche where we're treating a lot of people who got a lot of underlying trauma, and in kind of carving that out, we've created a program that is really well suited for first responders. So whether it's military, police, fire, correctional officers, EMTs, they got a lot of trauma, a lot of underlying trauma that has not been resolved, that is really at the core of what they're dealing with. And until that trauma gets addressed, whether it's substance or depression, we really are not going to be able to get at that. And so we've created a program where we're 30 and above. Our average age is around 45. It's a lot of first responders, but it's more kind of professionals who have some underlying trauma. Typically it's dual diagnosis, but not always, but most of the time it's dual diagnosis, and both chemical dependence and mental health. But our program really wants to look at treatment in a different way. The traditional model looked at the traditional chemical dependence treatment really focuses on the substance. You get in there and there's a lot of emphasis on drug of choice, and how do you just not use? Not use, don't use, don't use. And that's really kind of hammering it home. And the 12-step model, which I have nothing against the 12-step model, I think it's great, but a lot of programs that just focus on the 12 steps, it's really about, hey, this is the program, and if it's not working for you, you're not trying hard enough. And the reality is, individuals struggling with substance abuse, there's a lot of underlying issues, and not everyone's going to have the same recovery path. And so if we're going to be effective, we really got to help each individual understand kind of what are those underlying drivers, and what is the recovery path that's going to be best suited for them. The 12 steps is part of that. That's great. But we want to view the substance use as the symptom. It's a behavior, and if you're going to effectively address that behavior, you really got to understand those underlying issues. What is driving that symptom? And until you understand that, and you make sure that you've had a chance to address that, you're really swimming upstream. You're trying to just kind of change this one last decision. And that's part of the reason why treatment is so traditionally has been so ineffective is because you're trying to get someone to make a different decision, but you haven't really addressed those drivers to that decision. And people get out and they do okay for a while, but they're really just kind of white knuckling it, and eventually life stressors catch up with them. And unless they've really built a strong foundation and addressed those underlying issues and built some skills and competencies that allow them to be able to make those different decisions, it's going to catch up to them. And so we've really tried to create a program that is at its foundation really looking at it's a lot more holistic. It's looking at the whole self, understanding that it's all connected, and whether it's your family systems, your kind of personal relations, your biological wellness, all these things are connected, and all of them is about building resilience. We know that substance use is a stress response, and if we're going to address the stress response, we really got to build that resilience that allows us to be able to manage that stress in a different way. And so we're really looking at a lot of things that have nothing to do with the substance piece. We're going to address it, sure, but that's a very small part of what we're trying to do in treatment. We're really helping people build the best version of themselves, be able to build some skills and some tools to be able to manage the stressors in life, whether it be their relationships with their families, whether it be their coping tools at work, whether it be some financial stressors or taking care of themselves biologically. All these things are factors in building the best version of yourself and giving yourself the foundation to be able to now make some different decisions. And so that's really what we're trying to create.
That's incredible. And I think about first responders, and it is a very specialized group of people, and they're out there protecting us. They're out there putting their lives at risk regularly. And some of the coping strategies that they have in place that cause the trauma, you can't really take them away.
Yeah.
What's your perspective? How do you address that?
Well, a big part of it is starting to talk about it, right? There's historically been a culture with first responders that we don't really talk about it. This is just part of the job, and there's this cumulative stress that develops, as well as this vicarious trauma that they keep getting exposed to things over and over again, and the culture hasn't been where they are able to talk about it with their buddies. It's kind of like, hey, suck it up. And they get in this mode where they're not able to talk about it with their families because they don't want to, bring this traumatic stuff home and dump it on them. And so the coping mechanisms increasingly have been just going out to the bar and having a drink, and that just builds on itself, and eventually there's this kind of cumulative piece that develops, and eventually they snap. That's why they're seeing a much higher suicide rate than they are having officers and firefighters killed in the line of duty, by multiples. And it's only in the last several years that the culture has started to change and said, hey, we got to start to get our people help before the wheels come off. We got to start addressing this before they get to that point where they got a gun in their mouth. And so we're seeing departments start to address that, but it's a pretty slow process. But it's been really interesting and to be able to be a part of that, because we're going in and having these conversations with departments and their peer support. Our clients are coming out to us, and usually, like I said, when the wheels start coming off and things have really fallen apart, they come out to us. But really what we want to do with them is to be able to bring their peer support into their treatment process, help them understand what's going on, what are the skills and tools they're learning, bring them into the support network. So part of what we do is we will have that officer, that firefighter, bring their peer support into the conversation, and before they leave, we get on the phone with them, and we get on a Zoom session, and the officer will say, hey, this is what my plan looks like. Here's the tools and skills that I've built. here's what success looks like for me, here's what regression looks like for me, and I want you guys to be a part of that. And when you guys start to see these behaviors, I'm giving you permission to intervene. And I'm going to come and sit down with you on a regular basis, and we're going to have a check-in. And what it does is it starts to help them to start to have a different conversation with not only their employee who has got treatment, but to start to have a different conversation in their departments. And so really we're trying to normalize treatment and also start to change the conversation so that it is not so shame-based and taboo to get help.
Well, and that's part of the challenge is that, here's these first responders, everybody's depending on them and they can't let anybody down. So the stigma of saying, I'm not okay and I need help is pretty high. Do you see it shift?
Yeah, there is a big shift right now, but it's happening in certain departments. Certain departments are quite progressive, and they're trying to they're recognizing this. And part of this is driven by the fact that they can't get enough people right now to join the police force. There's a lot of stress right now, especially over this last year, and they can't hire enough people. They're getting a lot of people who are dealing with PTSD from just being an officer, and they're losing people. So they're recognizing that if we're going to keep people, we got to start getting them help. But there are still departments where an individual doesn't feel like they can come forward and say, I need help. So they're suffering in silence, and when they are going to get treatment, they're having to do it on the down low. But there's others that are coming and saying, hey buddy, we think you need help, let's go get you some help, and we're going to make sure that this is covered and we're paying for it, and you got the time off, and you're getting paid for it. And those ones are really the ones that are kind of driving the discussion nationally. We were just able to we are one of only a couple of facilities that are approved by the FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police, which is the largest police union, and we were able to just go out about a month ago to their second annual wellness conference. And so for the first time, they're starting to talk about this on a national level. How do we make sure that each of these departments and our union members have the resources and tools to start to get help before it gets to where they got to come to us?
Wow, that is incredible. That is incredible.
That's pretty awesome. It's interesting that I think as an industry we've seen some of that redirect from treating the symptom, right, which, like you talked about, the substance, to treating the emotional underlying issues, right? Yeah. And a lot of times that trauma might be childhood based, right? It might be past relationship or abuse based, or some type of a circumstance where maybe the individual isn't currently in, right? A lot of them, they're just, maybe the individual might not have learned those skills yet, yeah, right? Because they're just relationship skills or dealing with stress skills or whatever they are. This crowd can't quit, right? Yeah. Like that's part of the challenge. This is an individual's livelihood, right? And so if they're scared of showing up to work the next day, or running through that door, or making the next pullover, or whatever it is they're doing, I could see that being pretty scary on a day-to-day basis, yeah, right? And so it's super interesting that you've been able to help those individuals kind of make some of those adjustments. You talked about how when you got into the industry there were sacred cows, right? And I assume by sacred cow you mean, kind of practices that weren't being questioned, regardless of success or whatever. What are some of those things, right? Can you give us any idea, what maybe some of those things were? Because I would make the assumption that some of those were working, right? Some of them weren't, right? So there's some things that you just don't question, some good, some bad. What are some of those things, and what are some of the things that you've tried to replace those with?
Well, a big one was that the 12-step tradition. For a lot of people in this industry, they are in recovery themselves, so they kind of came through the process, and this worked for me, and I know it'll work for you if you just try harder. And so that was a big one. Also, there is kind of historically there is this fairly punitive approach to treatment, both in the adolescent world, but also in the substance world, where you're an addict, you don't know what's good for you. Obviously, what you've been doing hasn't been working. We're going to break you down, and we're going to teach you some discipline, and we're going to build you back up. And that is the way that treatment historically has happened, and even as we've it has evolved a little bit, and we're in nicer facilities, and there's some massages and sushi and whatnot. Still, at the core, there's a lot of programs that are still that way, where it's fairly punitive based, where where you're getting demerits, or you're losing your cigarette privilege, and we're gonna kind of coerce and manipulate to get the right result. And it seems kind of counterintuitive, but when you have these programs that are trying to move a lot of people through, and they're trying to make sure that everybody is kind of living up to a certain standard, unfortunately, that is the way a lot of treatment still happens. I don't feel that is a way to affect lasting change. You might get people to comply on the outside, but on the inside, they're flipping you off, and they're just biting their time until they can do what they want. Even with adolescents, even though that is, you have a little bit more latitude because they got to do what you tell them. But especially with adults, I think if you want to affect lasting change, you have to have a much more collaborative approach. You got to kind of work hand in hand with them to help them accomplish their goals, and you got to help them recognize that they're in the driver's seat. This is their program, and if this is going to work, they got to feel that sense of ownership and connection to it. If it's just somebody else's program, and you walk out that door and you get stressed and triggered, it's not going to work for you. You got to feel that sense of ownership, or you're not going to get creative about making it work when you get out. And really trying to get out of the role of we're the experts and we're going to tell you what to do, and move into the role of we're going to make you the expert. We're going to make you the owner of your own recovery, and you're going to be the one driving this. You get a lot of people who have been through treatment, and they get there and they want you to tell them what to do. And when we refuse to do that, and we say, hey, this is your recovery, we're putting you in the driver's seat, it's uncomfortable for people. They want to hey, tell me the hoops to jump through, and I'll jump through them. Give me the script, and I'll feed it back to you. But it seems fairly common sense, but it's a pretty big paradigm shift in the way things have been traditionally done. And so, that's one of the areas that we really wanted to change. And then just trying to recognize that on a day-to-day basis is we don't got it figured out. From client to client, we got to be pretty nimble and say, hey, what does this person need? And not everyone's going to need the same thing, and there's a lot of different resources we can bring to bear, and we got to be, release the ego enough that we're willing to change what we're doing, or make sure we're making adjustments so that each person is getting what they need. And even in the 8 years, almost 9 years that we've been doing this, the best practices and what evidence is showing us is working shifts all the time, and trying to stay on top of that and bring new resources to bear. We just added a really strong neurofeedback component, and it's amazing how that is really shifting kind of how people are thinking about it, and it's drastically changing recovery rates. But that's something that wasn't around 6 or 7 years ago when we started.
What is that? What's neurofeedback?
Neurofeedback is it's a system where we're hooking up these sensors to your brain, and it is monitoring what's going on in your head. And as your brain waves start to deviate and start to kind of go off course, it gives you some feedback and brings them back center. And so you can do these scans where you're able to identify which parts of the brain are firing and which parts are not, and create a protocol where it is helping to activate different regions of the brain. We have a system that's more dynamic, where it's constantly taking feedback, and as you start to veer off, as you start to kind of get distracted, it gives you some feedback and brings you back center. And the benefits in terms of what they're finding, whether it's for ADD or depression or anxiety or addiction, are huge. It's, I had one client that sat down his first time, and he'd been just kind of an anxious mess, just shaking, both knees going at all times, his hands just shaking. And he did his first 30-minute session, and he finished, and he's like, I didn't notice anything. But all the other clients were like, this is the first time in 20 days you haven't been shaking, and we don't even realize kind of the things that are going on, but it just helps us kind of learn how to manage our brains in such a way that it kind of trains them to kind of be more centered and not get distracted as much, and then get and stimulate your brain to be firing in a more balanced way.
So is it like a test? Is it a treatment?
It is a protocol. So you're hooked up to a system, and it is taking constant feedback from what's going on in your brain, and then it is changing the feedback that your brain's getting. So as you start to veer off, it gives you feedback and brings you back center. So somebody will be hooked up. We try to make sure that if someone's there for 30 days, they have about 20 sessions. They're hooked up to a system. They sit in a room, put some headphones on, and they can look at a screen that is also giving some feedback, or they can lay back and close their eyes, and it gives this feedback session. It's more kind of like brain training. So
that's super interesting. I've
Yeah.
never heard of that before.
And that's kind of just one example of the different resources we're trying to bring to bear, but we're constantly looking out there of what's working. Let's test it out. No time where we think we've arrived and we got the formula. I think the minute that you do that, and that you're not constantly trying to figure out what else you can do to help your clients succeed, you're kind of failing.
Yeah. It's easier to count relapses than it is to measure emotional growth.
Yeah.
Right? Or neurologic, or whatever the kind of growth it is you're achieving for. So it's interesting you talked about the punitive thing. So
I when we're even looking at outcomes, I don't love counting relapses, right? I don't love the traditional thinking of, how many days sober am I? And if I relapse, I'm starting over. The reality is, are you building a better quality of life? Do you have the skills and tools to be able to pick yourself back up when you do falter, and go from a relapse that takes a year to pull yourself out of to, I messed up and I had a bad weekend, and now I like to think of it more, we try to call it regression, partly because there's a lot of things that happen before that relapse that are regression, that if we can be aware of those things and address them before it gets to the point where it's a full-blown relapse, we can get ourselves back on course. And so when we're thinking about it, just, I succeeded or I failed, I relapsed, so I failed, and I'm going back to zero, that is both fairly shame-based, but also a bit debilitating in terms of, I failed, I messed up, I'm no good anymore, and for many people, it's tough to pull themselves back out of that, when if you can look at the bigger picture, I've created a better quality of life, my relationships are better, I'm a better person, I'm communicating better, and yeah, stress got the better of me and I messed up, but I'm picking myself back up and I'm getting back on track, and I'm going to learn from this, and now I know that I can't make these kind of decisions, or I'm going to find myself back in that spot. So let's not think about it that way. Let's think about it in terms of more, what is the quality of life that you've been able to create for yourself by these decisions, So
That's incredible. And I know you put a lot of effort and time into really scrutinizing some of these new programs like neurofeedback? How long did it take you to decide you were going to implement that into your program?
Well, as soon as I read the research on it, I jumped on figuring out how we implement it. It took a while to wade through all the different protocols out there and the different technologies and figure out which ones we wanted to bring on, because there's a lot of different companies and systems. But as soon as I read the research, there's some research papers, especially around alcohol use, the effectiveness of those who are engaged in neurofeedback well in treatment versus those who are not. As soon as I read that, I was like, it's not cheap, but we got to have that. You know, the thing I say, I want to be able to say at the end of the day to someone's parents or their spouse that we've done everything we possibly can to be able to help somebody succeed. And when I saw the statistics around that, I said, hey, we cannot go another month without having this as an option for our clients.
That's incredible. And I've heard a lot of really amazing work that's done with the neurofeedback. It's just such a great supplement. Let me shift gears just a little bit and ask you a question that I ask. I often ask people, or make a statement, and you tell me what you think about it, is that connection is the opposite of addiction. Do you agree or disagree, or how do you feel about that statement?
I totally agree. I think that is definitely the case, and it has definitely made this last year a lot harder for people. You know, coming to treatment and then discharging. When we're helping someone discharge, we're putting together a really robust discharge plan, and at the core of that is connection, right? It's how do you get involved, how do you get back and go build the relationships with your family and your community, how do you make sure you have this kind of support, and going home and being isolated and not being able to engage in that connection has been really hard for people. And I think it's been hard for even people who haven't come into treatment. I think it has made people struggling with substance abuse and depression and anxiety a lot tougher. And that connection is everything. You know, I think that's one of the reasons why treatment is so successful, is because we're in this close-knit group and they feel so connected. I think that's one of the benefits too of being more specific about who we treat, so that people are going through treatment with people that they can relate to and they can better support each other. But, you know, figuring out how we make sure that we take that connection and that community that they feel in treatment and it translates to when they get out has been, you know, a little bit of a challenge. We've had to rethink that because what we were doing before is just not possible right now. But we've gotten really creative about how we do that. But yeah, I agree with you completely that the opposite of addiction is connection and is community. And when you feel that sense of connection and that purpose that comes and the fulfillment that comes with being involved with people, that is at least half of it.
Yeah, it's huge. I agree. So I heard you say there was a time in your life before you had Chateau where you went out, played with some big animals, and tried to figure things out. What is connection and self-care? What does that look like in your life personally?
Well, I got 4 little kids, and so my self-care is kind of, I don't want to say hijacked by those little kids, but it is focused around those kids. For me, it's really important that a big part of what we do at Chateau is this mindfulness piece, and where I got work and I got my kids, and those consume most of my waking hours. Meditation is huge. I got to wake up early and have some time for myself, and to be able to have some mindfulness practice early in the morning before everything starts. And when I'm doing that, I can stay pretty grounded. But I notice pretty quickly when I'm not doing that how easy it is to get off kilter, and how much more stress affects me when I'm not taking that time. And that's one of the pieces that we we really focus on at Chateau is how do you figure out how to take some time for yourself and develop a mindfulness practice where you can just be a little bit more aware of what it is that you need, and you can start to see that coming before it gets off the rails.
And I know you had a list of things, that you wanted when as you got back into business and you wanted your own business, you wanted some things. Has Chateau fulfilled that for you?
Yeah. It definitely has. It's not one of those businesses where you can put it in autopilot and show up once every couple weeks. It is one that it's a human-based business, and it requires kind of constant tweaking and adjusting to make sure that we're meeting our clients' needs, and it definitely is. It is a lot more involved on a day-to-day basis than I had anticipated, but it is one that you go home feeling exhausted but fulfilled.
Very cool.
What's your school of meditation? What'd you learn?
Well, I lived in the job before I came here. I was living in India for about 3.5 years, and so I practiced with a bunch of different approaches. Kind of learned a bunch of different techniques, and kind of what I do is a combination of those now. But it's just 20 minutes of. I have some noise canceling headphones and some music that kind of just helps me avoid the distraction of little kids coming out. But just that, it's kind of a hybrid of a few different approaches. But if I can have just 20 minutes every morning, I'm good to go. Cool.
Very cool. And I think the work that you're doing is incredible. I always love keeping in touch and hearing the new things that you're trying to implement and all of the people that you're helping and serving. Interesting tidbit is that when I was doing my internship, I actually worked up at, it wasn't the Chateau then, it was another treatment facility, but I have a little history with that particular location, and so, it's near and dear to my heart. So I love hearing all of the different things you're implementing. It's pretty amazing. If if a first responder or someone else that's listening wants to be able to get a hold of you to find out more information of maybe how they can get help or what, even just information from you, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Just head to the website, chateaurecovery.com, and there's contact information there. We got reach out there, and someone will help navigate the process. We have a philosophy that we're not the right place for everybody, but we want to make sure that everybody who contacts us is able to get to a place that's going to be the right place for them. And so our team is great at helping people navigate that, helping people understand the treatment industry. It's a little daunting when you call looking for treatment to even understand what to ask and what are the relevant factors in deciding treatment. And we have some resources to provide people to just help them know what to ask and how to evaluate whether this is the right treatment for me. And so our guys are great at being able to help you just figure out what are the options and how do you navigate this process.
So even if they don't end up coming to Chateau, you're going to make sure that they have resources to make a good, solid decision.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what it's all about, right?
We're in the business of helping people get better, and we're not always going to be the right choice for people, but our job is to help them figure that out. And most of the people who call us don't come to us, but our guys help every single person figure out where's the right place to go.
That's incredible. Danny, thanks for coming today. Thanks for just sharing
pleasure.
your story and sharing, your passion and being willing to affect change.
Danny, fun to see the success that you've been having and be a part of that. You're growing, and we understand you're also keeping an eye out for an additional therapist to augment your staff, help you continue to grow. Is that true?
Yeah, we are. I got a search going on right now for another therapist who is trauma trained, is experienced in some different trauma modalities, Ideally, they have some experience working with the first responder population, if not a first responder themselves. But it's an environment where you got a lower caseload, a lot of more individual time with each client, and the ability to get pretty creative about the treatment interventions that we're bringing to bear. So it's a great opportunity for somebody who's the right fit, but in a smaller facility, we're really trying to focus on culture and making sure we have somebody that shares our treatment philosophy. So if there's somebody out there who either knows someone who would be a right fit or is interested, please reach out. I'd love to talk to you and figure out if we can make something happen.
Added benefit of getting to work in the beautiful Midway, Utah, right?
Yeah.
Oh my heck, I love that drive. Every day I would see the big balloons coming up the canyon, and I would live for that drive. It was beautiful.
There are uglier places to work.
Wow, it's incredible up there.
Thank you very much.